Aloha, this is Paul Brewbaker of TZ Economics in Kailua, Hawaii. Put together some slides for a little post-pandemic debrief on the Hawaii economy as we enter 2023. Got some new data and looking forward to what should be a pretty good year in terms of disinflation and maybe snaking through without a recession. We'll see how that landing goes, soft or hard. I'll turn right to the slides and we'll get into it without further ado. Mahalo to the Hawaii Young Presidents Organization that helps support today's work. And those of you who've seen my material before know that it's always evolving with the data. So some things may look familiar, but trust me, they've been updated. And so I'm going to focus on a handful of themes here. Inflation, of course, is the big one that's been hanging over everybody in the last year and is subsiding as we enter 2023. Some takeaways from fiscal relief and newer federal and possibly state fiscal infrastructure and other spending initiatives. Note on pandemic labor market changes, which have persisted in a different form from conditions that existed pre-COVID. Mention of where monetary policy is at and how that's likely to unfold. Basically a recap of what the Fed's already providing to us in forward guidance. And then one of the things that's really been of interest to me is the impact of the pandemic on workforce arrangements, remote work or telework, working from home, basically the same concept where a larger proportion of workers now are engaged in work either some of the time or all of the time at home in larger proportions than was the case before the pandemic. And it seems to be working out more or less pretty well. It is being worked out, but it's working out. And then just a final mention of some long-term concerns for the local economy. So when we look at inflation locally and then against the backdrop of the US experience, you can see one of several indications of how much harder the pandemic hit Hawaii's economy, shutting down tourism almost absolutely for 6 months in 2020. And then as recovery unfolded in 2021 with vaccination and continued in 2022, particularly tourism recovery, there's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back as variants and subvariants affected travel demand. So a weaker recovery from a deeper recession leading to lower inflation in Hawaii than has been manifested elsewhere in the country. But disinflation in both cases, going back to March of 2022, which is the peak for Hawaii inflation, and back to, I think it's July for the US. Now, both measures of consumer price inflation coming down solidly after erupting in the wake of the fiscal stimuli and vaccination as it unfolded in 2021, the reopening in 2021. On an annualized basis, the monthly US CPI has been trending downward all year. It might have happened sooner had it not been for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has had a clear impact in certain commodity markets, energy commodities for sure, but also Ukraine's a big one of the world's largest grain producers and is a significant player in manufacturing of the products, metals and whatnot. And in the Hawaii data, the same pattern of disinflation. If you annualize what in Hawaii are semi-annual reports, inflation reports. So negative inflation in November and therefore fourth quarter. This is an interpolated series from the bi-monthly Urban Hawaii Consumer Price Index. So outright deflation in Hawaii in the fourth quarter, which would pull the annual averages down. The pattern of inflation has been dominated by energy commodities, by food commodities, and as a reflection of supply chain disruptions. New and used vehicle prices. New vehicles couldn't be assembled as quickly as the recovery in global demand, and so spillover to used vehicles, which I didn't even know were in the CPI until last year, really showed up in these numbers. That was July and September. You can see July, really high inflation in in that energy space after the invasion of Ukraine, and all of those components then slowly subsiding over the course of the second half of 2022, so that that pressure is coming off, and you can see the all items number subsiding as well from 6.8 to 6.6 to 5.8% towards year end as used vehicle inflation went negative. If you split out the headline from the core Urban Hawaii Consumer Price Index, you can get a feel for what the composition between aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors is. The three fiscal stimuli, the CARES Act in March 2020, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which topped off the tank at the end of 2020, and then Biden's ARPA initiative, more consumer oriented, about $5 trillion altogether, created this, and combined with vaccination and the reopening in the economy, the liftoff in inflation is global demand, particularly for goods, outstripped the global supply chain's ability to revive production, particularly where many places in the supply chain continue to be adversely affected and production shut down by COVID, or just the linkages frayed from COVID. And so when you break down the annualized, there's been about a 6% annualized inflation over the last 2 years, or approaching 2 years now. If you break it down, there's really three components. The 2% inflation that Hawaii would have had on trend, actually 1.6%, because Hawaii was underperforming a little relative to the nation pre-COVID. Another 2 percentage points in the sort of core, 2.3 percentage points in the core, or think of it as kind of the aggregate demand part, inflation less food and energy costs. And then when you add in the food and energy costs, another 2 percentage points. So 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. And the supply chain re-articulation is bringing down the commodity factors, the supply side factors, but there's still some resistance on the demand side. We're going to have to think about this in the core that the Fed's still concerned about and will continue to posture against. Some good literature out there now pointing out that supply and demand factors have been about half-half contributors to the inflation. I mean, in round numbers, 60-40, 50-50, something like that. And so if you get a chance, links, by the way, get a chance to get a copy of the PDF from me, or let's see, Paul Brewbaker at tzeconomics.com. Paul, Brewbaker, Brewbaker, like you brew coffee, at tzeconomics.com. You can click on the links and find some of these interesting new papers out there doing the disaggregation. And a reminder that on average over about 80 years, you can see Hawaii's inflation rate does converge to the national average. The differential is 0 plus or minus a couple percentage points. We're at a low ebb right now, but over time, those tend to wash out. So monetary union, you get the same inflation rate. Economic union, you get the same inflation rate. The character of inflation in Hawaii in the last year and a half or two, again, beginning in March 2021, it's January 2023, the character has been much more like the inflation shocks in the post-World War II or even World War II era, that is exogenous shocks without a big crescendo of inflation expectations accompanying those events. Now, the Fed worked very hard with forward guidance and whatnot, stepping in, relative. I know people were thinking they should have moved earlier, and there was a feeling for a while that the transitory component, the supply side component, maybe would burn off on its own, which it has. But of course, nobody thought about another year of supply side disruptions coming from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, except for Vladimir Putin, maybe. And so this is going to end up being more like a one-off event than those crescendos you saw in the 70s and late 60s, early 70s, and then again in the Japan bubble and the subprime bubble. I mean, that's my sense of it. But it has had an unusual impact, let's say, on mortgage interest rates, which notwithstanding the inflation surges of the last 30, 40 years, mortgage rates, and as you know, the term structure of risk-free interest rates, U.S. Treasury, long-term U.S. Treasury yields have been subsiding, comparatively steadily with disinflation over the last 30, 40 years on trend. The recent event, partly because of the relatively abrupt intervention of the Federal Reserve, pulled those mortgage rates up very quickly. But here we're starting to see signs of an overshoot and bouncing back from 7%. So from 3% to 7% within a year, and then an overshoot and a retracement to 650, 630 or so. I would guess that we're headed back to a 5 handle in 2023, and we'll probably wind up near the average for the 20 teens, around 4%. So probably not back to 3%, but a 4% mortgage rate is, within focus over the next 18 months to 2 years. And unfortunately, as a consequence of the high mortgage rates, not so much prices, but we'll look at those in a second, but because of the suddenness and the magnitude of the mortgage interest rate, housing affordability eroded at a pace that we haven't seen in a long time. And the window of affordability that persisted all through the 20 teens, a long window of relatively affordable, steady home price appreciation, steady growth of jobs and incomes in Hawaii during the longest expansion in U.S. history, or maybe in history. The door slammed shut on that period of affordability when those mortgage rates jumped last year. So it's, again, almost certainly a transitory phenomenon, maybe over by the end of this year. To take a look at some of the supply side factors, most of them have burned off. This is the popularly cited Freightos Baltic Index of container costs. So from maybe $1,000, $1,200 to a tenfold increase to more than $10,000 per container as recovery and reopening and vaccination began to take hold in 2021. Second half of 2022, this has been burning off. And for Hawaii, where the trans-Pacific costs are important and container costs rose to, I think, almost 18,000 in the last 6 months. They've come down from 6,000 to 7,000 to the 1361 I pulled the other day. I had to piece these together because I have a cheap subscription and only get to look at 6 months of data. You can see the commodity space in general showing a similar reflection. These are lumber futures, random length lumber futures, mapped against the monthly producer price index for lumber, and really volatile. You can see kind of a double surge, one in 2021, and then a second one, which was unfortunate and of almost the same magnitude in absolute terms, absolute levels, had been burning off in the second half of the year. I haven't updated this for a few months, but I think you can pretty much imagine where it's going. Construction costs in general, or the materials costs for construction, erupted 40 to 50% in the course of 2021, before peaking and in the first half of 2022. But in the longer term view of things, is really an extraordinary, the first disruption of anything approaching this magnitude since the great commodity inflation of the 1970s. And really, I mean, it's just a shock going through the construction industry, which had gotten used to 2 to 3% inflation over a long period of about 40 years, and then suddenly was facing 40%, 45% inflation. And then, of course, the big role that was been played by petroleum and energy commodities in general. Natural gas in Europe may be showing up more vividly as an issue, and against the backdrop of decarbonization in general, which is created some vulnerabilities. The thing about energy inflation, I mean, oil prices were about $70, $80 a barrel pre-COVID, and then of course they fell with the drop in demand when the initial COVID shutdowns occurred. And then people lost their minds when oil prices went back to $70 or $80 a barrel. Like, ooh, there's energy inflation. Well, that's just reversing the deflation. So you end up in the same place, $70, $80 a barrel. And then the invasion of Ukraine came. So we went to 120, and now we're back to $70 or $80 a barrel. So, okay, take a chill pill. It's, the number is $70 or $80 a barrel. I mean, for now, we're looking at where global supplies are. And if you can run a regression of gasoline prices in Hawaii on oil prices and an underlying trend. And basically what you see is that, the main thing that drives people crazy in Hawaii is that gasoline prices don't come down. And so there's like a, downward stickiness, right? So they ratchet up really quickly, but then they don't come down as quickly when oil prices are falling. But okay, they will, chill out. Fiscal stimuli were a big part of the recovery, obviously, but in retrospect, probably a bit of overkill. I don't know. Nobody knew what the right number was. The 2 trillion in the CARES package was not enough. Almost immediately, people recognized that. But in retrospect, 5 trillion, maybe 3.5 to 4 might have been the right number. We'll never really know. The challenge, of course, is that the ARPA came in. I think it's almost 1.9 trillion. But the first year, $1 trillion in outlays and another $0.5 trillion in the course of 2022, with a very different formulation, right? Payments to individuals and support for state and local governments being the leading components of the Biden administration, so the Democratic Party's leadership approach, and support in the form of child tax credits and so on that made a big difference for poverty in the course of the year until they expired. In contrast, the Republican approach under the prior Trump administration was more business oriented in terms of relative magnitude, so that the Consolidated Appropriations Act after the 2020 election in December 2020 replenished many of those initial, with about 900 million in support, many of the programs that were set up in the original CARES Act, which of course what did have bipartisan approach was appropriate in its moment, in the moment of March 2020 with the pandemic raging. But of course, we should be drawing lessons for how to do this and how not to do it. And my concern is that we're not really doing that. We just sort of moved on without really thinking about, was this the right design? Do we go to corporations first and small businesses, or should we focus on individuals, et cetera, et cetera? So, someday we'll have that conversation happening in academia. Early on, it was clear that, as with windfall income distribution in general, right, debt reduction, right, a windfall income gain people have a higher savings propensity associated with it. So a lot of it went into debt service reduction, and then personal savings, which then positioned households to revive or sustain consumption when the reopening came into view 1 year after the original CARES Act. In retrospect, the programs that funneled support directly to state and local governments, which were most likely to spend those funds as opposed to saving them, were very effective, or relatively effective. And the least effective were the notorious Paycheck Protection Program, non-refundable loans. And it's hilarious how people are complaining about, we're going to forgive student debt, and that's all controversial, where we gave away 800 billion in loans to businesses, less than 1/3 of this, which less than 1/3 of the 800 billion actually went to paychecks or preserving jobs, and the remainder went to owners, shareholders, suppliers, etc. So yeah, the redesign, we should probably think about that at some point. What do we set up as an automatic or trigger, a triggered response in this future, like we haven't had that conversation before? What can we learn from the way the Europeans did it, which was mostly just putting money in people's bank accounts, through the tax department. Think about that for a second. So negative taxes, and other issues like I don't think Hawaii ever was able to pay out all its unemployment insurance, was it? I mean, the whole system collapsed for 6 months. I mean, I'm not throwing stones at anybody. I'm just saying that's a fact, Jack. So yeah, we should be looking at that. Currently, there's a lot of excitement about the fact that the state government seems to have extra money because they couldn't figure out how to spend it during the pandemic. What? So, if you want these numbers, check them out. They're all now published. And in the right column, which is revenues on the top and expenditures on the bottom in real terms, you can see what's happening. The budget forecasts were lower pre-COVID than they are now, which is kind of surprising given that the economy is not. I'll say that again. The budget forecast is higher post-COVID than it was pre-COVID, even though Hawaii GDP is not higher. So go figure. And then the state government got its act together finally in the fiscal year that began in July 2021 and managed to spend or at least allocate a bunch of money. Probably haven't spent a lot of it yet. But the question is that really sustainable? Just a quick note, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act of late 2021, a congressional bipartisan bill that was designed to be revenue neutral, more or less, is rolling now. And the White House has data, if you're interested, on what kinds of allocations were in mind through Hawaii's congressional delegation. And so if you can get your hands on that, check it out. There's going to be a lot of construction. I don't know. We're building speed humps around here, so not new highways, but whatever. We'll see what happens there. Lots of money coming on the defense side for Pearl Harbor naval shipyard enhancements, etc. So we've seen a very different experience in the labor market generally from what we thought was normal pre-COVID. We're not going back to pre-COVID. And in Hawaii, jobs have never gone back to where they were pre-COVID by like 40 to 45,000 jobs. And so, yeah, I don't know where those robust state revenue forecasts come from, but the money's not going to be falling from heaven forever. Meanwhile, structurally, some other changes in the workforce. And so you've been hearing about the Great Resignation, a surge in quits, a surge in job openings that's even larger than it's been in the past. So unfilled jobs at a time when people are also rearranging their it's musical chairs in the job market, and the workers seem to be at a strategic advantage. Combination of longer term factors that were limiting labor supply growth, combined with the instantaneous disruption of the pandemic and the subsequent consequences in worker behavior and attitudes and so on. So if you remember the Beveridge curve, it's the relationship between the job opening rate and the unemployment rate. And basically what we've seen in the last year or two, is about twice as many job openings as there are unemployed persons in Hawaii. So you see this parallel shift of the Beveridge curve, way more job openings as a percent of jobs, given a particular unemployment rate. So say at 4% unemployment or 3.5% or wherever Hawaii is right now, there's twice as many jobs open. It's basically 2 jobs open for every person unemployed, which, yeah, it's kind of a seller's market in the labor force. Now, there are longer term factors. I mentioned the gradual decline in labor force participation that's coming from aging in the population, in particular among men who tend to be retired, in the boomer cohort, tending to retire a little bit earlier. And then after the pandemic, Another half percentage point or percentage point of the workforce seemed to have stepped aside without returning. And then there are these other patterns that have emerged. Oh, lower fertility, which means fewer young persons as a proportion of the workforce entering the workforce over time. And this is unfolding now for decades. In the 3 or 4 decades after World War II, right, from the 1940s through the 1970s, it was going the other way. Participation was rising as women were entering the workforce in numbers and proportions that had not been seen in the past, and social changes were occurring. So what we didn't observe was this pattern that was picked up in a paper presented at the Fed's Jackson Hole meetings a couple of years ago, where you see those little yellow swooshes. Each time you reach an unemployment rate trough, you enter another one of these swooshy cycles where the detrended participation rate has a cascading U-shaped profile now. In the post World War II era, it swooshed upward because each one of these participation cycles, more women were entering than before. Well, now it's working the other way. So we'll have to see where that goes. At the HEA conference, Hawaii Economic Association conference in the fall, somebody asked me about this in the Q&A about, so what's happening in the labor market? And I said, well, 1 million dead Americans. It's just, I mean, here's the list of things that I've been reading about. There's so many weird little things that have added up to make this. Okay, so COVID mortality didn't affect the workforce that much because most COVID deaths were older people who are not labor force participants. So numerically, 1.2 million Americans died, but most of them weren't workers. Huge impact psychologically, however, on the way people look at work, the way people approaching retirement look at continuing to work, whether they should continue to expose themselves to workplace, health risk factors, and more broadly in customer-facing services jobs, many of which, the typical restaurant where young people work, they don't have sick leave, no vacation, the base wage is very low, they rely on tips and other gimmicks to sort of pay their workers. So, and then, it turns out employers and customers don't really care as much about workers as, that was kind of revealed by the, you get COVID and you don't get sick leave, but what kind of workplace is that? I mentioned early retirement among the boomers, and then government support, which sustained unemployment for somewhat longer intervals. Although what we've seen in the review of those data is not enough to explain the whole thing. It did, however, enable people to conduct job searches for longer, wait for the right job. But then, in addition, there have been structural changes because COVID affected some industries differently from others, and then had these other sort of preference shifts on the labor supply side of the market, that the matching was inefficient between job search, people searching for workers and companies searching for workers, and people searching for jobs. The DACA thing is really important and was affected by biological risk. So in general, by the time we got to vaccination, workers had a lot more bargaining power, both in terms of the convergence of long-term factors and lower labor force, organic growth, and more departures without returns, among these many other factors. And of course, we should be thinking about another long-term factor, which is long COVID. And people, there's going to be mass disability as cognitive, pulmonary, and neurological problems affect people in coming years, as a legacy of the pandemic, notwithstanding the fact that we survived it, so to speak. Monetary policy, not much to say here that the Fed doesn't already say very well on its own. You got to hand it to these guys. They give you their forecast. They tell you what they're going to do and when they're going to do it and by how much. It's really great. I have to say, shout out to forward guidance. But so I think we can reassure ourselves from the way things have transpired, which is pretty much the way the Fed told us they should if they intervene the way they think they would. Inflation expectations measured by the difference between nominal Treasury yields and tip yields are back to 2.225, 2.125%, which is about, it's like the Fed's PCE inflation goal of 2% plus the quarter or half percentage point structural differential that causes the Lasperes index to be higher than a Posh index. You can also think of it as a bit of an inflation risk premium, if you will, and surely an inflation risk premium, however small, would be no smaller than it was in the relatively tranquil years of the pre-COVID expansion. On the balance sheet side of the Fed's asset purchases and now asset maturation as assets roll off the balance sheet of the Fed without replacement at a pace that they're telling us is about 95 billion a month. You can see the Fed's balance sheet shrinking as mortgage-backed securities and Treasury securities mature. The big change now is on the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet, where reverse repos have gradually displaced reserve deposits as commercial banks, deposits at the Federal Reserve as the primary source of the deep pool of liquidity on which banks have relied since the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the corruption or the dissolution of what had been the kind of interbank funding that we took for granted in the past. So confidence is liquidity. The lack of confidence after the financial crisis led the Fed to create a deep pool of liquidity through asset purchases. Another round of that after the onset of COVID. And now as we drain off that liquidity as confidence is restored, the composition of contingent liquidity or overnight liquidity that the Fed maintains on behalf of the banking system is switching to these reverse repos, which are sort of like overnight loans. I mean, basically, as opposed to banks just parking reserves that, let's remember, they could be lending out and through the deposit creation multiplier and so on, contributing to economic expansion. So reverse repos, keep your eyes on them. The December forecast of the FOMC or projections for the Fed funds target rate now go over 5% by the end of this year, from a 4 1/3, I think is the range right now, in the rapid ascent from nearly zero 1 year ago. So that's that's heartbreaking and a sudden stop, but again, accompanied by forward guidance and fulfillment of markets' expectations. And I would have to say successful fulfillment of the expectation that their policy could restrain the demand side contributors to inflation, primarily through the housing market and investment generally. But at the same time that global supply factors were normalizing and bringing down, resolving the disruptions and the dislocations that had inhibited the supply response when demand was increasing. They're looking for a gradual descent to the long-run equilibrium of 2.5% on the overnight rate target. And I see no reason to think that that's wrong. My own instinct is to think it might happen faster than that, but that's, I tend to be more optimistic about these things right now anyway. The composition of aggregate demand, personal consumption expenditure in particular, is very different post-COVID from what it was pre-COVID. You can see the very steady trajectories. I mean, it's consumption, right? People just follow it's like an escalator. These are constant dollar real personal consumption expenditures, U.S. personal consumption expenditures on services and goods. We're a services and information producing economy because we're a services and information consuming economy. But look how different the impact of both federal relief and stimuli and the recovery in consumer confidence and consumer spending in general. Look how different the impact was on the goods side of the economy than it was on the services side. Now, what got disrupted in the global supply chain. Goods demand moved way harder than anybody expected on the supply side. Why? Because the supply side was set up for that escalator. The supply side was, global supply chains were set up for 4% growth, annual growth in constant dollars in U.S. personal consumption of goods. And, it's like, think about how a toilet paper factory works, right? There's no excess capacity. There's no seasonal variation in toilet paper use. So they're set up to produce exactly the right amount in, the logistics miracle that we have today with, you're right, there is no warehouse, right? It goes straight basically from the factory to your door now on Amazon. But the point is that the composition effect compounded the fact that goods demand increased, compounded the fact that goods supply was the part of the economy that wasn't going to be able to respond. And so again, to return to this point about inflation, and here we're looking at the PCE deflator measure that the Fed uses, that the 2% FOMC goal for inflation is stated in terms of the personal consumption expenditure deflator. You can see how the split between core, or the 5% inflation that excludes food and energy, and then the additional 2 percentage points, or now maybe 1.5, that's coming from food and energy, which prices are burning. I mean, what are you going to do about avian flu? How many millions of chickens have been killed by avian flu? That has nothing to do with the Federal Reserve, right? Russians shooting missiles at apartment buildings in Ukraine. The hell does that have to do with monetary policy? And there's nothing the Federal Reserve can do about some of these things. But what's problematic, and why the Fed continues to maintain a very stern posture against inflation, is the fact that the core rate isn't coming down as fast as the headline rate by this metric. And obviously that's an appropriate posture, given that people will freak out if they don't. Side effects: strong dollar means that Japanese visitor spending, should the Japanese, or when the Japanese come back in larger numbers, right, it impairs your export competitiveness, and Hawaii exports tourism, with any luck, to Japanese, who tend to spend a little more per day than their US mainland counterparts. So it's just bad timing on this. And just another thing to mention in passing about inflation: this is the share of corporate profits in each dollar of US value added, going back to the post-war era, post-World War II era. So, right, in the 40s and 50s, about 2 cents on every dollar of value added in America comprised corporate profits. 2 cents on every dollar. Today it's 17. It's gone up 50% since COVID. Okay, so when people are complaining about corporate profits, yeah, that's what they're talking about. It's a real thing, you guys. Okay, well, let's look at the deeper structural impacts that are happening in the workplace as a result of work from home. So two views, right? The donut effect, that the pandemic was like this rogue wave that sent people fleeing from urban core and centers of employment out to suburbs and exurbs and Zoom towns across America, because they could work remotely. There's an unplanned, synchronous, simultaneous experiment in working from home, and it worked out for a lot of people. Not everybody, but for enough people that it's not going back. Although, when that wave in terms of housing demand went outward from the urban core, there was backwash, because after a year or two, the urban core was relatively affordable. You see what I mean? The demand's going the other way, and so values in town, so to speak, maybe they had risen, they just hadn't risen as much. And we'll look at that for a while in a second. Now, there's good empirical work suggesting that half of the home price appreciation in America since 2019 is attributable to remote work. So we're looking for something that's had a material secondary impact, right? Obviously, the workplace is changing. The technology allows distributed work in many occupations and many skill categories and not others. And theoretically, up to a third of the workforce could work remotely. It looks like about 20% in Hawaii of the workforce is working remotely, more like 40% in the San Francisco Bay Area. About half of that in hybrid arrangements where people are in workplaces collectively 2 or 3 days a week and then at home 2 or 3 days a work week. And the employers want you there 3 days and the workers want to be there 2 days. And so there's an average. In the first year of the pandemic, in 2020, the donut effect was observable on Oahu in terms of these. I'm sorry, I'm looking at a slide. I thought I had fixed something in this slide, but in terms of the rates of single-family home price appreciation in these outlying areas on the North Shore, windward side of Oahu, East Honolulu, in the highlands, Makakilo, Mililani, and in the urban core neighborhoods, prices were falling. Now look at the data for 2022. A bit of a reversal. Even as prices peaked in mid-2020, single-family home prices peaked and then began descending. And by the way, the median on Oahu in December 2022 was about the same as it was in December 2021. So the real action was in 2021. But the laggards, the guys still catching up, were in town, not as clearly as 2 years earlier. And look where Kailua was. Kailua Waimanalo was at the low end of the spectrum in terms of appreciation, whereas 2 years ago, way up there in the leading pack. So we had a bit of this phenomenon here on Oahu, where single-family home prices after the pandemic event went into kind of a bubblicious phase that lasted through the first few months of 2022 until interest rates really started to swing the hammer and knock back demand. On the condo side, not as much, but again, you have the situation where if single-family home prices are rising and single-family home prices rising in, say, outlying neighborhoods, whereas urban core condos and multifamily dwellings are not appreciating as rapidly, are not experiencing the same bubblicious outcome after a year or two, they're relatively inexpensive. I mean, they're more expensive because they're appreciating on trend at 5%, but they haven't gotten as much more expensive as single family homes. So we're seeing some of that come back, and just to, put Oahu in an urban context with peers and maybe exemplars, the ratio of the housing stock to the resident population on Oahu is about 0.37. It's 0.38 in San Francisco. It's 0.32 in San Jose, which sort of notoriously has a tight housing market. In Vienna, which has extensive social housing systems in place, has had for 100 years, the ratio is more than 0.5. So it could be that social housing is the solution, but it could also be that, there's one house for every two people, one housing unit for every two people in Vienna, and there's only one house for every 2.5 or 3 people on Oahu. I mean, supply makes a difference. Either way, what we've seen after the pandemic is this shift outward of demand, at least initially, and then an asymmetry in bubblicious valuation dynamics, which led to a bit of a backwash, because it's not just that the condos haven't gotten as much more expensive as did single family homes. It's because the people who live in condos are looking for a lifestyle that fits a profile that you're not going to find out in the suburbs. And so you saw in the data that condos did a little bit of a catch up. Now, there are other behaviors that have changed we should talk about. Composition matters, right? We live in a different world from the one in the mid 20th century with lots of independent households, working women, and many more seniors, many more senior women living on their own, able to live on their own, and or in other arrangements than traditional married family with children arrangements. And But beyond that, we've seen a pattern of post-pandemic changes in behavior that also have impact for commercial real estate. So retail spending remains about 20% higher than it was in January 2020. These are, I'm comparing here spending data from credit and debit card swipes, high frequency data, to Google smartphone mobility data. So people spend 15, 20% more on retail, but they spend 10 to 20% less time in retail establishments than they did pre-COVID. Now, part of that is a one-time jump in e-commerce, and I should have put that slide in here. I've got those data too. So a one-time jump in e-commerce, which was rising anyway, so sort of front-running the growth of e-commerce that was going to occur anyway, and maybe at some point, if you're looking at Amazon, is reaching a saturation, approaching a saturation moment. But clearly, we're past the point where these are temporary changes. A 20% reduction in the amount of time people spend in retail establishments, retail, food service, recreational establishments, combined with almost a 20% increase in spending, tells you something structural has changed. And you need to think about how much retail space is going to stay in retail. When you look at spending, what am I doing here? Oh, this is the old chart. I got to delete that chart. This is the new chart. I updated these data. Google discontinued publishing their mobility data, but again, you see that pattern. 20% increase in spending, excluding groceries, 10% including groceries or just on groceries, and then 20% less time in retail establishments. If you look at the services sector, you can see spending on remote services also has been favored. And of course, it sort of makes sense, but it persists now relative to January 2020. Remote services are persisting in a favored position relative to in-person services. And a lot of this is reflected in the jump in remote work and is an artifact of changes related to the increase in remote work. These are Google searches on the phrase working from home. So they've about doubled relative to the index to the post-COVID peak, but they're about double what they were pre-COVID right now. And so an example of, what we call a hysteresis, which is a temporary change that turns out to be permanent, right? The searching on the phrase working from home, you could understand why it jumped after COVID temporarily, but the fact that it persists at 2 to 3 times the volume that it did pre-COVID is an interesting measure. We have new census survey data that show that about 20% of adults in Hawaii lived in households in which at least one adult teleworked previously because of COVID, but the more recent surveys, what do they say? Yeah, they just identify households where someone worked from home in the last 7 days for any reason. And we also have from American Community Survey data now for 2021, a very stark doubling from a little over 5% of the workforce that did not commute, right? The share who teleworked full-time from home pre-COVID was about 5 to 5.5%. And the share post-COVID is about 10 to 10.5%. And I'm guessing that that's L-shaped, that's going to stay. Parallel to that, or correlated with that, a decrease, a one-time decrease in the average commute time by about 3 minutes, which doesn't seem like much, but almost 10%. And presumably that'll go back to the path it was on before. But again, and hysteresis, a change, some people like your HR department was hoping was going to be temporary and is turning out to be permanent. People spend 30% less time in workplaces and 5% more time at home. Now, Google has stopped publishing these data, so this is the last time we'll see this particular data set. But I think it's safe to say that working from home is here to stay, as one paper said. These are older data I've used in the past just to point out that pre-COVID, about 10%, only 10% of workers either worked full-time or part-time in significant numbers. Whereas the numbers as they settled down, obviously a post-COVID jump, settled down, revealed really interesting patterns, higher educational attainment associated with greater propensities for work from home, more women than men in every age cohort, and more millennials than boomers across the board. Things have settled down, as I say, but the industry patterns do suggest that penetration of remote work in information, professional, business services, financial services, and whatnot, academia, will persist at comparatively high levels. Whereas in many interested industries, you've got to be on the job: construction, accommodation, and food services. So this split between industries where financial services, professional services are, more prevalent adopters, and then at the bottom of the list, construction, accommodation, food services, transportation, where in-person is really required, is also a pattern that sorts itself out by occupation. So within some of those consumer-facing industries, there are occupations that have the possibility of working remotely. But as a generalization, they tend to be occupations with computer and math, legal, finance, science, and social science skills, architecture, engineering, etc., just as you'd expect. And the consensus now among Bureau of Labor Statistics researchers, these are statements of the commissioner of the BLS a couple of years ago now, conjecturing that we're not going back to pre-COVID, is being borne out not only in a wide array of data, but also in an extraordinary pattern of business formation. By the way, there's another one you can look up, which the Census Bureau calculates an index of business formation, which has a very similar pattern. But again, an hysteresis where you thought that the increase in applications, in this case for a federal employer ID number after the onset of the pandemic, you thought maybe that was a one-time jump and then it will settle back to the pre-COVID pattern. No, it's not settling back. Something structural has changed here. And well, I don't know if these are TikTok influences or who they are, but something's really going on. And I mentioned, I leave this to other people who know more about this, but I stole these data from Mike Hamasu and Bloomberg just to show how the jump in office vacancy from 10% to 15% pre to post-COVID is a pattern you see in Honolulu, according to Mike, but elsewhere, if not quantitatively identically, then certainly qualitatively around the world. So changes you think are temporary that turn out to be permanent are the things you'll have to continue to deal with, and they're affecting the labor market, and it's probably worth getting used to it, because it does appear that there are productivity growth implications that have been congenial. John Fernald, who's spoken to the Hawaii Economic Association a couple of times, presented a paper to the most recent Jackson Hole conference in which he suggested that work from home was really the place where productivity growth was occurring, and labor productivity growth, as opposed to total factor productivity, persisted. You can see after, you always see in a recession and recovery cycle, you always see a jump in labor productivity as firms are reluctant to hire initially in recovery. They wait to see whether the recovery is going to stick around. In the case of post-COVID, we kind of had a double peak here. We had a second wave of productivity growth even after the recovery was in full swing. Now it's gone to zero, so we have to think about what's going on there. But it was going to zero. Maybe that's just social media, as some people would argue it was after the iPhone dropped. In terms of total factor productivity, we don't have data, but the pattern towards lower productivity growth is present in several of these productivity time series. and maybe work from home is helping to reverse that, at least temporarily. Maybe it'll have a permanent impact as we settle into the pattern. However, unfortunately for Hawaii, GDP got off track well before COVID. Hawaii real GDP got off track in 2017, began to drift sideways and downwards, and has yet to really mount a recovery that takes it back to pre-COVID levels, whereas the US economy, US GDP, has reverted to its pre-COVID trend. So I do have longer term concerns about Hawaii's economy that are deeper than, however persuaded I am that many of the structural changes like work from home are actually productivity enhancing. Hawaii has deeper problems, not the least of which is that for the last generation or two, maybe the last half century, the income premium that Hawaii enjoyed after at the peak of the post World War II emerging market surge, the post statehood, early statehood surge in per capita real income growth, we have squandered, and we enter the 2020s as a below average state, and one in which, for example, the island of Hawaii, Big Island, is essentially Louisiana. And no offense to either, but that's a fact, Jack. So I'll stop there, and you can reach me at Paul Brewbaker at tzeconomics.com, TZ Economics, all one word, and BREWBAKER. Mahalo for your time. See you next time.